It is the third week of February and it's time to check on the bees. 4 weeks ago I fed the ladies some sugar candy and was glad to see that the hives look pretty good. I'm in Michigan and our winters can be tough on a colony, although today it is in the mid-40s. All right, still looking good. Notice that I have a 3-inch frame on the top to provide space for the block of sugar candy, and that there are a couple of 1/2-inch spacers to keep the block off the top of the frame. Actually, the spacers you see are a set I used for the first feeding, and there are 2 more below the block of sugar that is covered by the bees. When I fed last month, the bees were at the top of the frames, pretty much as I see them now. So when I put down the spacers and set the block of sugar, I'm sure I mushed some of the bees in the process. I certainly disturbed the cluster. Had I been on the ball, I would have had a feeding frame already set up. That way I could have popped the cover and put on the frame with the sugar block with minimal disturbance to the bees and without squishing them. Here is another colony. Same thing. On the left you can see what's remaining of the sugar block from a month ago. These gals are pretty mellow right now, but that wasn't the case when I put on the sugar block. Again, the idea is to feed the bees, not rile them up. Beekeeping is ever the learning process, so when I finished feeding the bees, I went back into the workshop and made some frames to use for feeding. And as we will see, with a couple of simple additions, I now have a frame that I can use during the summer for sugar dusting, and a frame that I can use when feeding sugar syrup in the fall with the Ziploc baggie method. A 3-in-1-er. So let's go and build some feeding frames in the Beekeepers workshop. Let's take a close look at today's project. The frame is nothing more than a simple box with 2 3/4-inch rims sliced off the bottom. The top is simply a spacer. The middle rim has an aluminum window screen attached to the bottom. And the bottom has a 1/2-inch hardware cloth attached to the top. Together, and in various combinations, you can use this frame for at least 3 different jobs in the bee yard. You might be able to think of even more. If you only need one frame, you can make it out of number 2 1x4 pine. However, in today's project, we are going to use a 1x8 in order to make a double-wide box. By simply cutting the box in half, we'll end up with 2 frames with no more work. If you only need one, still consider making 2 frames and giving one to a beekeeping buddy. But be sure to tell them it's from a Beekeeper's workshop. To make the box, we will be using a spline joint. This joint consists of a tenon groove on the end board and a matching dado on the sideboard. A 1/4-inch thick spline fits into the groove, mating the 2 boards. A spline joint has a lot going for it. There's a lot of glue surface, so the joint is strong. Also, a tight-fitting spline helps to square up the corners. And finally, the joint is relatively easy to make using a table saw and well within the scope of most workshops. I use a spline joint for a lot of different projects in my workshop and have been quite satisfied with the results. It is a good joint to get to know. Now let's get started. For the box, we will need 2 pieces 19 7/8 inches long for the sides, so I have set a stop at this distance. And we will need 2 pieces at 14 3/4 inches for the ends. Again, I use a stop. To make the box, we will be using the tenon jig. The tenon jig gives me a rock-steady hold on the boards and keeps my fingers safely away from the blade. I am using a set of stacked dado blades for a 1/4-inch cut. The fence is set for a 1/4 inch between the tenon and the inside of the blade. The height of the blade is 3/8 of an inch plus an additional 32nd. This height allows for a bit of room for the spline during glue-up. On the end boards, we need to cut the tenon groove on both ends. Clamp the board securely to the tenon jig and run her through. Notice that there's a tendency for the board to lift as it is being cut. To deal with this, after the first pass, funk the board back down in place and run it through a second time. Rotate the board keeping the same side facing out. And cut the tenon groove on the other end. Again, I run it through twice to make sure the groove is full depth. For the dado on the longboards, use the tenon jig as a spacer. As before, rotate the board, making sure you do not flip it over, and cut a dado on the other end. When it is all said and done, this is what your boards will look like. Use a 1x4 to make the splines. Set the fence 1/4 of an inch from the inside of the blade. I usually have to make a few test splines to see how they fit in the box grooves. You are going for a snug fit, not too tight and certainly not too loose. Once you have found the sweet spot, cut a sufficient number of splines for the project. You might want to consider cutting some extra splines as you will surely use them sooner or later. Before we glue up the box, I recommend that you mark the locations of the saw cuts that will be done on the assembled box. You will need to know these locations so that you can avoid putting a nail where the cut will be. I have made 2 lines at the top 3/4 inches apart, a middle line, and 2 lines at the bottom also 3/4 inches apart. Now we are ready for the glue up. You want to make sure that the joint is entirely covered with glue, including the grooves. As always, I am using Franklin's Titebond exterior glue and a glue brush to make sure I get a good, even spread. The spline should also be covered with glue. Of course, the tenon groove on the end boards also needs to be glued. Notice how the boards are almost square. That is a hallmark of a tight-fitting spline joint. After we get one end done, we simply repeat the process on the other end. Don't forget the spline. And finally, put on the last board. After the box is assembled, tamp the joints to make sure everything is good and snug. Use clamps to hold the box together while the glue dries. Be sure to check for square. After the glue dries, we can paint the inside and outside of the box before cutting it up. I recommend using the best latex paint you can find and use 3 coats of paint, 1 primer and 2 top coats. You are only going to paint this gadget once, so you might as well do it right the first time. Check for square one last time and then give the glue time to set up. Shortly we will be cutting the 3/4 inch rims from both sides of the box. And because we will be using screws to reattach the rims in various combinations, this is a good time to drill pilot holes for the screws. Drilling the pilot holes now will ensure that the holes line up later on. I'm using a drill press, although you can just as easily use a hand drill for this job. After the rims are cut from the frame, it is easy to get confused as to the order in which the rims are assembled. For this reason, you might want to consider striking some sort of line on the box to help remember the order in which the rims are attached. You can see this diagonal line on the bottom inside of the box. We are now ready to cut the box into the required pieces. First, I'm going to slice off two 3/4 inch rims from each end of the box. I have set the saw blade 3/4 inch from the fence to the inside of the blade and high enough to cut through the 3/4 inch board. It is simply a matter of making a cut, rotating the box, and making the next cut. You may recall earlier that we marked the box for the location of each of these cuts to avoid putting a nail in the cut line. It's not good to have the blade run into a nail. After removing the two rims from each end, I have moved the fence so that the blade is exactly in the middle of the remaining part of the box. Now I cut the box in two. The rims will be attached to the frame using bugle-headed screws, so it is a good idea to countersink the pilot holes so that the head of the screws are flush with the rim. Although you can easily use a hand drill for this operation, I like to use a drill press. With a hand drill, sometimes it gets away from you and the countersink is too deep. The drill press avoids this problem. We're done with the saw work and we now have two frames. Before I attach the screens, I'm going to go ahead and paint the edges to completely seal the wood. To finish this project, all we have to do is attach the screen and wire mesh to the rims. As you can see, the window screen will be stapled to the bottom of the middle rim, and the wire mesh will be stapled to the top of the bottom rim. I will cut both the window screen and the wire mesh 1 inch larger than the frame's length and width. This will allow a 1/2 inch folded hem on all four sides. Stapling through this hem will strengthen the hold and prevent tear out of the screen. A standard T50 shop stapler is good enough for the window screen. For the wire mesh, I have folded over the edges 1/2 inch on all four sides, just like the window screen. Now I am using an air stapler with 1/2 inch staples. I am trying to catch the mesh where the wires cross. After all the screens are stapled, we are ready for final assembly. Looks tight. All we need to do is to use screws to attach the two bottom rims to the top frame. Later on, we can remove the screws and configure the rims and frame for the job at hand. And with the last screw, we are done. Well, we're done. We started with a 1x8 and ended up with two Sugar-Duster sugar feeding frames. When feeding your bees syrup during the summer with the Ziploc bagging method, just use the top frame. When feeding your bees during the winter with sugar candy, use the bottom and the top frame. And when sugar dusting your bees during the summer for mite control, use all three. A 3-in-1er. Thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed yourself making this handy gadget in the Beekeepers workshop.